there, Dwayne Carter Workman. Glad you're back with us. Now, I started showing you in Acts 11 something very significant here, and you really need to get this, especially in terms of the blessed King James Bible, the perfectly preserved, verbally inspired, God-breathed Bible that we have been so blessed to have and to hold and to read and to learn and to study. Praise God for that King James Bible. Now, I just showed you, but before we quit, I wanted to show you the significance of Antioch. I showed you Antioch. God just pounds it home. Acts 11:19, Antioch. 11:20, Antioch. 11:22, Antioch. 11:26, Antioch. Twice. 11:27, Antioch. God hammers it home. Note, at the end of verse 26, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. The first time anybody is called a Christian is in Antioch. Now, this is very, very significant because Antioch is the key city in primitive New Testament Christianity, church age Christianity. This city serves as the home base of Paul's important missionary endeavors. Now, this shows us Antioch is the original home of the message of salvation by grace through faith. This Antioch is the place where the disciples, as I told you, were called Christians first. Thus, with all this in mind, it is only natural that the home base and hub of the early Christian church would be the place where the first translations of the New Testament would be circulated, and it would be in the language of the populace. Thus, the text from Antioch is called Assyrian type text or Byzantine text. And throughout the Reformation, it was known as the Textus Receptus or Imperial Text. So folks, our Bible comes from right here. It comes from Antioch. The true texts come from Antioch. The perverted texts come from Alexandria, Egypt. And they're Westcott and Hort, 1881, New Testament 1885, rest of the Bible. The perverted text started there, ASV and on through. They used those Westcott and Hort texts from Alexandria, Egypt. God never says anything good about Egypt. That ought to tell you something. Right here's where we get our Bible, folks. Not hanging up there, continuing in the transition, Acts 12. Now, interesting here. At this point, I'd like to make a point about this chapter. That may not be critical, but it's very interesting. Acts 12, 1 and 2, we'll read that. It says, now at this time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. He took Peter into custody, but it says he killed, in verse 2, James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now, this is approximately, according to the dates we have, approximately 42 A.D. that Herod kills James Zebedee, the brother of John. Now, I personally believe that James Zebedee is the author of the book of James. I realize few people believe that in most prominent independent fundamental Baptist circles. But I just wanted you to think for a minute. They say it can't be him because he's killed here, and this date of 42 A.D. is much earlier than the date most people like to, most scholars like to ascribe to the book of James. Now, this can't be proven one way or the other, but I would like you to think on a couple of points. The doctrinal contents of the book of James show no acquaintance at all with Pauline gospel of grace. Think about that. No, he doesn't have, it doesn't appear to have any knowledge at all of the grace that Paul is continuously writing about through the Pauline epistles. Now why? Why, I believe the material found in James, it breathes from start to finish of a pre-Pauline revelation, written to Jews of the dispersion between Acts 2 and 10. Now, there is much material in the book of James that doctrinally applies to the Jews in the tribulation. Now, bear in mind, what we've just studied in Acts 1 to 7, they were a second chance for Israel to receive the Messiah, and if they had received Jesus Christ, the tribulation would have soon began. Now, also, as I've taught you, if you've viewed the lessons, Peter is preaching in Acts 2, 15 to 21, a tribulation passage from the book of Joel. Also, he's preaching in Acts 3, 19 to 21 on the restitution of all things, national cleansing, with Israel's sins being blotted out. Also, tribulation. And if I may also throw in personally, I find it strange that Peter, James, and John were the big three, or the inner circle of Jesus Christ throughout the Gospels, as I'm sure you're aware of. So I find it strange that Peter and John wrote books that were included in the canon, but not James. Well, as I said, I believe the book of James was written by James. I believe he was included. And if you think of the book order in the latter part of the New Testament, after Hebrews comes James, 1st and 2nd Peter, then 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. And there you'd have the big three right together, James, Peter, and John. Check it out and think about it. The early date would match perfectly the material presented in James. And folks, you've got to admit that James does not appear to smoothly fit with Paul's writings in many places. You have to do a little twisting around there to make it fit. If James was written early, as I've just presented, it would make absolutely perfect sense. Think on that one. Now, in Acts 13 and 14, we find detailed missionary journeys as Paul and others take the gospel of the grace of God to anywhere and everywhere they can. There's still much opposition from the Jews, even those who do not openly oppose the new gospel with hatred and hostility. Still, they manage to cause problems for the missionary efforts by adding various works of the law contrary to what has been revealed by the disciples. The missionaries return back to Antioch, the hub, as I showed you here in Acts 11. And at the end of, in the end of chapter 14, if you'll notice, verse 26, it says, "And thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God, to the work which they fulfilled. And when they were come together and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And there they abode long time with the disciples." So here again, they spent 1.5 years in Acts 11 in Antioch, where the text, original Byzantine text, comes from. And now, boom, back here in Antioch, they spend, the Bible tells us, long time there again. Antioch is the springboard, the hub of early Christianity. And that's where our Bible comes from, folks. There's no doubt about it. Now, in our next lesson, we are going to get into a very, very important chapter, Acts 15. And you might glance at that before you view the next lesson. it's a very critically important chapter because this chapter, Acts 15, as we've been seeing the changes through, how we had the first man saved, and it's exactly like we are in Acts 8. The gospel of the grace of God is being revealed. First Gentiles saved in 10. Then they go on out on the missionary journeys. And as I told you, even those Jews that didn't openly oppose them with hostility, they were trying to add works to salvation and works to keeping their salvation. And this caused quite a stir, and this is what causes this concourse to be called together in Acts 15, and it's a critical chapter. Please be tuned in. Dwayne Carr at the Workman. God bless.